All right. Please have a seat, everybody, if you haven't already. And at this point, I would like to invite alumnus Father Scott Murray to come up and say an opening prayer.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Trust this time for our Blessed Mother as we pray together. Hail Mary,
Full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Our Lady, seat of wisdom.
Pray for us.
Saint Joseph.
Pray for us.
Saint Elizabeth of Hungary.
Pray for us.
The Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 4th annual Dr. Keith Cassidy Lecture. Thank you all for coming out. I'd like to welcome all our guests from far and wide, faculty, staff, students, alumni, and also in a particular way, any common visitors, potential students, having a look at the life of Our Lady Seat of Wisdom College. This lecture series was established in honor of Professor Emeritus of History and past President of the College, Dr. Keith Cassidy. It involves a yearly lecture by a noted intellectual on a topic of interest to the academic community. Dr. Keith Cassidy, an accomplished historian who taught at the University of Guelph for 35 years, was a member of Our Lady Seat of Wisdom's Academic Senate starting in 2008, and then academic dean in 2009, and then president, of course, from 2009 to 2019. He took Our Lady Seat of Wisdom from being an academy to a degree-granting college, and we all will always owe him a great debt. Tonight's speaker is, of course, Very Reverend Father Paul Pearson, who is the superior of the Toronto Oratory and Rector and Dean of St. Philip's Seminary. So a bit of background on Father Paul, who was born of Mennonite and Southern Baptist parents in Illinois. He studied intellectual history at Cornell College in Iowa, where he was baptized and received into the Catholic Church in his final year. He then moved on to Toronto for graduate work in medieval studies. At the University of Toronto's Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, he received his MA, licentiate, and PhD. He has spent most of his life teaching at St. Philip's Seminary, beginning as a layman at the seminary's inception in 1984. A year after beginning to teach at the seminary, he entered the community and was ordained a priest in 1989. Since 1990, he has served as dean of the seminary, teaching courses in fundamental theology, human nature, and philosophy of God in the philosophy division, as well as many courses on St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae in the theology division. Father Paul was elected provost of the Toronto Oratory in June 2020. And I should add that there's a special connection between St. Philip's Seminary and Father Paul Pearson in particular, and Our Lady Seat of Wisdom, in that two of our founding professors, Professor John Paul Meenan and Professor Scott Nicholson, were formed at the seminary, and were basically got inspiration, I think, in many ways for the curriculum of Our Lady Seat of Wisdom through their experience as seminarians before coming here to found Our Lady Seat of Wisdom. So we owe a great debt to Father Paul Pearson and his colleagues and the Oratory in general. So Father Paul Pearson's seminar courses in the seminary on Dante's Divine Comedy gave rise to a 3-part series of books called Spiritual Direction from Dante. This is an excellent series of books on Dante, well worth reading, whether you're someone who has taken courses and specialized in Dante, or whether you're a first-time reader of Dante. There's something of great value for anyone in this series, and we, of course, have it for sale at the back of the hall. You can take a look afterwards, after the talk. You can purchase the series right here. So tonight, Father Pearson will speak on Dante, Hope, for the unheroic. His topic for this lecture will focus on the Paradiso and how not all those who succeed in getting to heaven are necessarily always heroically virtuous. Please welcome Father Paul Pearson.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. For many different reasons, I'm honored to be here to speak with you today. Of course, as Professor Shankton's noted, since the beginning of the college, I've had a connection with Mr. Scott Nicholson and John Paul Meenan, but that link goes beyond just personal friendship. It's founded upon a commitment to a view of education, Catholic liberal arts education in particular, that we hold in common. The world in general and the church in Canada and throughout North America are in particular need of what you're doing here, more than ever, even though the world seems to recognize it less and less. I'm happy to lend my personal support to you and to your work. I'm also honored to be asked to speak about Dante, someone for whom I've developed a deep affection over decades, whose works I've been teaching since 1990, and I did my master's thesis on him back in 1982. You can do the math. And whose Divine Comedy has been the focus, as we were saying, of 3 recent books of mine, Spiritual Direction from Dante. But I'm most especially moved to be asked to speak in the Cassidy lecture series in honor of Keith Cassidy, a longtime friend and co-conspirator in the battle for Catholic education. When we were much younger, it was the 1980s, even with a strong dose of idealism that young people often have, we were convinced that we seemed to be Davids walking into an entire convention of Goliaths. What could we possibly do? What could we hope to accomplish? The plans for a Catholic college and a new seminary were in the back of our minds. But even finding suitable education for his children seemed a task for a Catholic Hercules, not an overworked history professor and a sleep-deprived graduate student. Who were we to think of engaging in a battle like this? We were choosing to march where angels, way wiser than we are, barely dare to tread. This sense of being called to perform a function apparently far beyond one's ability is really the inspiration for our topic today. Hope for the unheroic. As a convert, I've been wrestling with this topic for decades. As a new Catholic, I had a secret dread of walking into Mass and seeing the priest in red vestments, a sign that we were celebrating the feast of the martyrs. Their example seemed entirely unattainable, at least to somebody like me. They were like superheroes, and I felt like a fairly unpromising child in their presence. Their greatness appeared to belong to a different race of people, a people stronger and more heroic than any people I knew, and certainly more heroic than I was, or thought I could ever be. How can I hope to be like them? This sense of what I call liturgical terror wasn't limited to merely the Feast of the Martyrs. Many of the lives of the saints could inspire the same sort of feeling, a sort of awe mixed with despair. I remember hearing an account of the life of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, who had her first ecstasy and her first communion, made a vow of chastity before she knew what chastity was, and before she knew what a vow was. What chance did I have with somebody like that, already a saint? But I suppose none of that should have surprised me. The gospel already warned me of this uncomfortable truth. After our Lord had pronounced the Beatitudes and told us to love our enemies, he summed up his good news with the words that finish the 5th chapter of Matthew's gospel. and also finished me. Be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. Really? Don't you just hear in the back of your head that saying that you always hear, nobody's perfect? And if you haven't heard it, you certainly feel it. Is it really possible that salvation and holiness are possibilities really only for a select few people? People who are particularly gifted, who have courage and heroism branded into their personalities. Could it be that I simply don't have the right stuff for holiness? Some people do seem to have drive and courage branded into them. But what about the rest of us? When, as a new Catholic, I asked this question to my far more experienced Catholic friends, who were universally unhelpful, one of them quipped that he wasn't shooting for heaven just for purgatory. You know, purgatory isn't an eternal destination. It's a pathway, a journey that always ends in paradise. In the end, there's only heaven and hell. You're either going to be a saint or you're going to be damned. I'd have to belong to one of those two. Heaven must be possible for people like me if the good news is really going to be good news. Heaven must be possible for ordinary people if the church is truly Catholic or universal. If God wills the salvation of all, as St. Paul wrote to Timothy. I think it would be easier to argue for the universal possibility of heaven if everyone were basically dealt the same hand. If we were simply blank slates, identical to one another, we'd all at least have an equal chance. But you know, we're not. We're unique from the beginning. Different personalities from the start. Parents of small children learn this fairly quickly. You think you got the first one figured out. You learned all the tricks. Then the second one comes and none of those tricks work. After me come 5 sisters. My mother said, "You did not prepare me for this." As though that were my fault. My mother liked to tell the story of my seemingly congenital impatience. As a toddler, I asked her what our family dinner time was. And she told me 6 o'clock, which was easy to figure out even in the old-fashioned clocks that had the hands, right? Big hands up, small hands down, 6 o'clock. When I saw that the time was right, I would climb up into my high chair and wait. And when dinner wasn't presented to me immediately, I would stare at my mother judgmentally. I was what she called the censorious talker. My sisters never did anything like that. My mother had to go find them every time there was a meal. And so they forgot that eating was something human. But I did it, like almost every day. Being late would always annoy me. I tell my seminarians when their first paper is assigned, I said, by the way, the paper is due on such and such a day. That's the deadline. Do you know what a deadline is? A deadline is a line past which you're dead. Feel free to use that. This is more than just a random anecdote, though. As a child, I was already a character, but so were you. So is everybody. We're created as unique persons, and we're created that way for a reason. Environment might trigger us or affect how our personality unfolds, but there's already something there that unfolds. It's already part of you. But how does this reality of being me which is different from being you, affect our ability to get to heaven? What if my personal traits don't lend themselves to heroism? Is that just my tough luck? I found a helpful way of reconciling these difficulties about the human condition and our ultimate destiny in what many modern readers might find an unusual place: a medieval Renaissance epic poem, Dante's Divine Comedy. Despite many people's stereotypes of the harsh, fire and brimstone Middle Ages, Dante provides a surprisingly inclusive and humane understanding of the invitation to heaven. His ideas, I think, are in keeping with the Church's constant teaching, but they also foreshadow that teaching long before these doctrines had unfolded fully over time under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Dante is firmly convinced that less than heroic souls can hope for heaven. And he wants us to be convinced too. In 1990, I was teaching seminarians about how to do mental prayer. And I said, well, you read the passage of the gospel and you draw a point to meditate on out of it. And they looked at me as though I just pulled a rabbit out of my hat and said, exactly how do you do that? Couldn't you just give us a book that listed topics you can meditate on? I said, no. You need to be able to read the book and get ideas from it. Their reply was, why? I said, because you're going to have to preach someday. I said, no, it would be nice for you to be able to read. My standards of education have gone up over the years. I want you to be able to read and understand for yourself. And so I thought, how can I help them read scripture? Well, I thought Dante writes his Divine Comedy consciously with 4 levels of meaning, just like scripture. He's very sort of, perhaps a little lacking in humility in this way, trying to write like God writes. I thought, well, this might be more accessible. So I didn't tell my seminarians that it was a poem. That might scare 19-year-old guys away. I just said, we're going to read Divine Comedy. I think some of them thought it was going to be funny. Throw things out there, just hope they get through. And sure enough, the course filled up, and we started reading it, and they became more and more enthusiastic. We'd read it out loud, and just stop every few lines and talk. What does that mean? What's he get? Why does he use that image? By the way, that's the way these books work. I actually just sort of mimic what we did in class. So every few lines in Dante, there's a number, and you can just stop and go and read it and say, oh, that's what I missed. And then once you see it is, go back and read that passage again. And now you can say, oh, I get where he got that. And then the next time something like that comes up, you just might get it before I tell you. That's the goal, learning how to read by having it be sort of modeled for you. So that's what the Divine Comedy started out as a project for me, to teach people how to read, to teach them how to read carefully, to draw personal lessons from. And as I was reading Dante more and more, I realized there are a lot of spiritual lessons there. Now, the Divine Comedy happens in 3 parts. Inferno, that a lot of people read. I read Inferno in high school first. Hell of a school. There's all sorts of puns you can have when teaching Inferno. And I read it again twice in university, and I read it in graduate school 3 times, I think. But I was doing medieval studies. It's not surprising. But not so many people go on and read Oratory, which is part 2. And even fewer read Paradiso. So basically, the big story, if you haven't read Dante, is this. Dante's messed up his life big time. Well, his life has been messed up for him too. He's been put into exile. He's separated from his family. All his goods have been confiscated, and his name has been besmirched. He's not happy. He's plotting revenge. He's ready to fight back. And so, he gets more and more wrapped up in this. And three things: lust, anger, and avarice begin to grow in his very fertile soul. And gradually the vines creep around him, and he's being strangled by these three vices. And you know what he does to solve that? Nothing. He can't solve it by himself. It requires what we would call in modern parlance an intervention. You see, the Blessed Virgin Mary is looking down on him from heaven. And Mom notices that something's wrong. She says, he's losing it. And so, the Blessed Virgin Mary called over St. Lucy and said, Lucy, this guy's your special, he has you as a special patron. You need to do something. Lucy said, oh, yeah, okay. And Lucy called over another friend of hers, Beatrice, who was Dante's special muse, who died as a young woman. And these three decided that they were going to take Dante on a guided tour of the afterlife, literally to scare the hell out of him. And so, Dante finds himself lost, and a guide appears, Virgil, poet, and Virgil guides Dante through hell, which is pretty darn terrifying. And the whole reason for this experience of hell is to make us see what sin is doing to us all the time. Because the punishments in hell aren't things that devils impose upon you. They're really just the damaging effects of sin exposed. You see, you do it to yourself. You do it to yourself by twisting up your soul by sin. And that twisting causes pain. And if God leaves you in that twisted state forever, guess what? You suffer forever. Not because somebody is poking you with a pitchfork, but because you're twisted and damaged by sin. After developing what was a very healthy hatred for sin, a disgust for all the damage that it did, Dante was fully convinced, I'm sick of this and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get out of here. He climbs up out of hell and discovers that he's at the base of a mountain, Mount Purgatory, the original 7-story mountain. You read Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. That's what it's based upon, the 7 terraces of purgatory. That's the mountain he's talking about. So Dante goes up and realizes how to get rid of these vices as he goes up. And you know, each time he gets rid of a vice, he feels lighter. And it gets easier to climb. He feels himself more powerful. He's able to stand in the light without being blinded. He's able to join in the joy of paradise more and more as it goes on. He feels transformed just by letting go of sin. So finally he gets to the top of paradise, top of purgatory, an earthly paradise, and realizes that now he's free from sin. But there's still something far better than this. And he gets wafted up to heaven at the beginning of Paradiso, the 3rd volume. And there, he's guided now by Beatrice. And that's where we sort of step into tonight's talk. Because after sort of finding his bearings, Dante is going to begin talking to these holy souls, and that the very first souls he meets are the ones who are most important for tonight's talk. So, when Dante's been mysteriously transported to paradise, at first he's overwhelmed by the light and the beauty he sees there. He says no created mind could possibly describe what he observes adequately. And then with typical humility, he sets out to do just that. But he's lost his bearings. He literally doesn't know which way is up. He's shocked that he, with all his spiritual, personal, and psychological baggage, should find himself in heaven. He says to Beatrice, I am amazed that I should rise so high. What am I doing here? How did I get here? But Beatrice explains, you shouldn't be surprised because this is what God's been working on all along. She says, and to that place, as to our destined sight, we're speeded by the power of that cord. Yeah. This is what God has had in mind for you from all eternity. And he's created the universe as a conspiracy to get you there. The only person who can break that conspiracy is you. It's as though she were saying to Dante, you shouldn't be surprised by being in heaven, because this is the grand finale that God's been working on since the first moment of creation. Now, the structure of heaven that Dante experiences immediately begins to address his fears and misgivings. Paradise is organized into 9 spheres. Think of it like concentric spheres all together. The earth is there at the middle, at least that's the way it seems. I warn you ahead of time that things aren't quite what they seem. The first of these concentric spheres around the earth is the moon, Mercury, and Venus. Those are the 3 we're going to be talking about most. These were all traditionally considered to be under the shadow of the earth. Oh. Now, we'll leave the medieval astronomy.
Hello.
Hello.
That really isn't our concern here.
How are you, sweetheart?
What Dante learns
But I just missed a call from you.
is to mute yourself. What Dante learns is that the souls who reside here,
Oh, that's what it was. We are listening.
otherwise they couldn't be in heaven. But that charity was somehow limited or restricted by the cares of this world, by fear, by attachment to worldly acclaim and human respect, and by attachment to material pleasures. Sphere of the moon, mainly fearfulness getting in the way. Sphere of Mercury, the attachment to human respect and worldly acclaim. And finally, not surprisingly, the sphere of Venus, material pleasures. Yeah, all those material pleasures. You know what they are. Now, in these people, these attachments weren't mortal sins. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in heaven. But they did live charity with less intensity than they might have done. Now, the first blessed souls that Dante encounters are in the sphere of the moon. Beatrice explains to Dante that these souls are in this particular sphere, these are her words, for failing to fulfill their vows. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? These people made a promise to God and then didn't fulfill them. That sounds like a big sin to me. I left the priesthood tomorrow, you think that was bad? If you left your wife tomorrow, people would comment. Breaking a vow is a big deal. How are these people in heaven? Their identity, at least at the start, appears to be that of a failure. Sort of spiritual loser. But their story is way more complicated than that. And it's important, at least from Dante's point of view, that we treat these people not just as abstractions, but as people with a real story. Complicated lives, just like ours. Dante learns from these souls firsthand, from one of the souls himself, a woman named Picarda, who turns out to be a relation of Dante's on his wife's side, but I guess he didn't pay much attention at the family reunions because he doesn't really recognize her. She explains that these souls had made vows of one sort or another, usually going into a convent, but were pressured into breaking them. They're all very sad stories. Picarda didn't choose to leave the convent. She didn't grow bored or grow attached to earthly desires. She was snatched away by her family. You see, powerful families often force daughters out of convents after pushing them into them, and force them into marriages that were going to be advantageous to the family's financial or political status. Perhaps they left behind their vowed state with all the possible proper ecclesiastical permissions. Perhaps they left without sinning. But with greater zeal, couldn't they have stayed? Couldn't they have fought about for this? Some saints, faced with the same situation, did fight. They had the strength to fight back. Perhaps Dante would have in mind the example of his near contemporary, Saint Margaret of Hungary. It's not Elizabeth of Hungary or Margaret of Scotland, we've just had those both. Not conflating, that's all right. Margaret of Hungary. After Margaret had lived in a Dominican convent and gave herself to Christ as a spiritual bride, Margaret's father, King Bela of Hungary, Bela IV, I think, petitioned the Pope to give Margaret permission to leave the convent and be dispensed of her vows in order to marry King Ottokar of Bohemia. That way, Bohemia and Hungary could be sort of friendly, right? But Margaret would not consider it. Papal permission or not. She had made her promise to God, and that was it. She threatened to cut off her nose and her lips if her father didn't back off. And not surprisingly, he did. You can't help but be impressed by such heroic gumption. In part because it's fairly rare. But clearly, Picarda wasn't up to a similar feat. So what's our attitude to Picarda supposed to be? Are we just supposed to look at it and say, yeah, that's a sad story? Are we supposed to be grateful to God that he allowed such a weak and defective creature to make it into heaven? A little triumph of mercy. God lets her in on a technicality. Dante at first focuses upon her basically being defective, being a spiritual loser. He talks about her lowness, her state. She readily admits, I'm in the lowest sphere of heaven. I'm in the bottom place of the heavenly kingdom. Because of her lack of fight, she says, this place, which seems so low, is given us. Now, reading carefully, she didn't say this place which is so low, but which seems so low. Because not everything is as it seems. Thinking of the many spheres that are above them, 8 more of them, Dante quite naturally asks her, do you desire a place of greater height? To see more, know more, and be held more dear? Shouldn't you be at least a little ambitious for something better? What's wrong with you? Don't you have any fire of the love of God inside of you? Come on, go big. Somehow it seems to be a defect not to want to be Great. Piccarda's response to Dante is quite simple. She looks at him and she smiles. She's not smiling out of embarrassment for her state. She's embarrassed for him. Because, well, he doesn't really get it. At least not yet. Despite his questions, though, Dante already hints to us as his reader that he hasn't made up his mind entirely about Piccarda and her companions. Should he pity them for being so low, or honor them for being saints? His questions suggest the former way. Poor things, bottom of heaven. But listen how he addresses her when he first meets her. Oh, well-created spirit. He doesn't meet a defect. What he witnesses is a glory beyond all his imagining, beyond anything he's experienced on earth. His first feeling is, my goodness, oh, well-created spirit. He didn't recognize her at first, even though he knew her on earth. And his explanation was just not that he hadn't been paying attention, but that because your wondrous countenances shine with something that transforms their image. Something I cannot fathom it. Something divine. What he saw in them was a divine light shining out, which made them so transfigured that they were unrecognizable. He stands before these souls in awe of the divine light that shines out from inside of them, and yet he still tries to pity them, as though they were a sort of heavenly failure, a poor relation admitted to the party but kept away from the high table. Piccarda gently and patiently dispels Dante's confusion, and I hope ours too. She says, it would be an offense against God to indulge in these thoughts of being elsewhere in heaven. If we should feel a yearning to be higher, such a desire would strike disharmony against his will, who knows and wills us here. Somehow, their being in the lowest place of heaven is more than a matter of human negligence on their part. It's part of divine providence. And all of the explanation for why this is the case hasn't been given yet. Dante now understands that the diversity he will see in paradise is not a side effect of unequal effort. It's more than that. It's a product of God's plan. Then he says, it was clear to me that everywhere in heaven is paradise. Though the high good does not rain down his grace on all souls there equally. What do you mean God doesn't give us all equal grace? That seems unfair to our 21st century egalitarian minds. God's supposed to be just. He must give me the same thing he gives everybody else. Were you immaculately conceived? No. Well, you didn't get as much as the Blessed Virgin then, did you? So just get over it. We don't get the same amount of grace. We're created very differently. And that's God's choice. Now, to say it's God's choice makes me go, okay, well, it's God's choice. It's not really an explanation, is it? Is there a method behind his madness? We're about to see that. Dante gets an opportunity to reflect on our individual personalities, again in the sphere of Venus. Here he's speaking with Charles Martel of Anjou. No, not the grandfather Charlemagne. This is a different Charles Martel. It's very confusing. Charles Martel is from a long and distinguished family. And his long and distinguished family is making a mess of Europe in Dante's time. And so the topic of conversation is, how can such noble and good families produce such degenerate children? Nothing personal to the visitors here. Charles is very quick to reject any simplistic idea that good genes make good people. I apologize to all the hereditary nobles who are here tonight, too. According to Charles, who sees all things from a heavenly perspective, God works providing for the natures of mankind with all that's fit to make them blessed and whole. Not only does God give me an individual and unique nature, personality which belongs to me and to me alone, He also provides what is ever necessary to bring that unique and idiosyncratic personality to its individual fulfillment. God respects and fosters what He has made. In many ways, this emphasis upon the intrinsic value of the individual is one of the defining inspirations of the Renaissance. Dante is often considered one of the founding fathers of the Renaissance, he and Boccaccio. I remember one book that famously said, with one foot firmly planted in the Middle Ages, with the other he saluted the rising sun of the Renaissance. And I realized that not only was Dante a better writer than I was, he was way more flexible. This idea of the uniqueness of the human person, 250 years later, would lead St. Philip Neri, the founder of my community, to insist upon the flexibility of directors in directing human souls. He would say to members of the Oratory, if you direct two souls along the same path, you're misguiding at least one of them. At least one of them, maybe both. But two people on the same path, that never works. People often come to spiritual direction and say, I'm here for spiritual direction. What should I do? And I look at them and say, I don't know. And why did I come to you? I said, I don't know. I can't tell you what to do with your life until I know what your life is. I can't tell you how to make your personality perfect until I have met your personality. It requires an interaction with the individual. Souls are individual and deserve individual care. So, God creates us unequal, and He gives us the graces and all the things we need to make our unequal natures as good as they can be. But really, if you're God and you're the creator of the universe, why don't you just make perfect souls instead of all these lesser souls? Why not just make a consistent crop of top quality ones? Is this supposed diversity really anything more than a defense of defective goods? Dante begins to see the value of spiritual diversity later on in the same sphere of Venus. He encounters a soul, cleric, who's overcome a battle against sins of the flesh, pretty much all of them. Again, it might sound like a defect rather than a defining characteristic, this powerful passion he had, a big concupiscible appetite, we might call it. But here, that big appetite hasn't disappeared. It's been transformed. That other gladness she'd made known to me as rare and dear approached us like the sight of a fine ruby glimmering in the sun. He was described as a fine ruby, symbolic of the fiery passion in his soul, passion which dominated his soul while he was on earth, but still there in the purified person. Still there, giving him a different glow in heaven. He glows red. Purgatory has washed away the disorder, but not the passion itself. He still glows red. The passion has been reformed, not eliminated, like a jewel that's been cleaned and faceted, and now sparkles and shines, revealing its true beauty. His passion is now part of his perfection, not merely a reminder of sin. The great person in this particular area of Venus is Rahab. Remember Rahab? She was the prostitute, right? Who was in Jericho, and when the people of Israel snuck into Jericho to scout it out, they closed the gates and said, how are we going to get out of here? And she hid them up on the roof. And he said to her, listen, if you don't betray us, we'll help you. She says, okay, when you are victorious, and I know God's already blessing you, don't kill me and my family. He said, hang a red cord around the window, and we'll know not to come in here. Red cord, always considered a sign of Christ's blood. Here, she's part of the red crowd still. You see, her passion didn't go away. It got cleaned up. They display holiness in a very different flavor from the religious and public officials that we meet in the sphere of the moon or of Mercury. So which version of holiness is the true one? You see, since we're all reflections of an infinite God, no one version can claim to be the best. Another piece in the puzzle is presented to Dante later on in the sphere of Jupiter, where the righteous rulers dwell. Now, these righteous rulers were all big deals on earth. They read like the who's who. King David, and you have some surprises, like the Emperor Trajan, or the Trojan King Ripheus, pagans. God's surprising. But all of them were big. They ruled. They shone like stars on earth, and now they shine like stars in heaven. Each one put his stamp on his territory. In paradise, their individual shining doesn't go away, but now it gets used. See, each one of them is like a star, but together they make constellations. Think of each one of them like a little pixel on your computer screen. And they get together by some preordained plan, and they spell out messages. The words that say, 401 slow to. Those, like, they can change them easily because it's just turning on and off little pixels. These great souls get together and are willing to use their own shining to make a message happen. This is how Dante describes what he saw there. And in that jovial torchlight, jovial is the adjective for Jupiter, in that jovial torchlight, I could see the flames of love in characters of flame spell out our human speech before my eyes. Souls of these great leaders were presenting their own personal splendor as a means of spelling out the heavenly message. No one soul could do that on his own. It takes a cooperative effort to spell this out. And the truth that all the souls in heaven come together to communicate is the glory of God, the infinite glory of God. I think often we think about heaven from a sort of human point of view, as though heaven were created just to give me a nice place to go when I've been good. But you have a purpose in heaven, which isn't just about your happiness. You're there to give glory to God. Think about the motto of St. Ignatius, ad maiorem Dei gloriam, to the greater glory of God. All that we do is supposed to give glory to God in this life, but especially in the next. You don't go to heaven merely to have a good time. That's certainly part of it, but it's more. You're there to give glory to God. And how can you do that? What finite being could reflect God's glory? Well, I was reading in an astronomy magazine, because I'm a sort of geek, and I do these things. Astronomy and brain things are things I still read about. And scientists came up with a way of mimicking a telescope, which was in fact unbuildable. They wanted to make a reflector disc that was like kilometers wide. Problem is, if you build something that big, it deforms or it breaks. So how do you get a 3-kilometer wide telescope? The answer is, you don't have one telescope. You take a bunch of telescopes that are maybe just manageable size, and you make an array of them that spreads out for 3 kilometers. And you put them all at different angles so that they all focus on the same object. And they end up producing the same effect as this enormous telescope. And in the same way, no one of us could reflect God's glory. But if we take all of us together, all reflecting God's glory in a slightly different way, together we can manifest that glory more effectively. Now, that's only going to work if you reflect God's glory differently from the way that I do. If we're exactly the same, one of us is sort of useless. So if that's true, if you're there to reflect God's glory in a unique way, a way that cannot be replaced by anybody else, your place in heaven as an individual actually matters. I think we have a fear that if we try to become holy, we're going to end up being sort of bland and like everybody else. Like a plaster saint. You look at the saint and think, yeah, that's a saint. Who is it? I can't really tell. You read the life story, born of poor but pious parents, and you're like, I don't know who that is. They all sound the same. And you become holy and you pray all the time and you become basically like a clone of holy clones. I think we're all sort of afraid of that somehow I'll lose my individuality if I become holy. I like to give the example of finding a bunch of uncut jewels buried in the dirt. When they're covered with mud, uncut jewels look pretty much the same. When you begin to wash them off, you can begin maybe to tell the difference between an emerald and a ruby and a sapphire and a diamond. But you know, those don't sparkle until you cut them and fasten them. And now the true individual splendor of those jewels shines forth. Holiness doesn't cover up your individuality. It reveals it. You see, heaven is designed for individuals. And you, as a unique person, have a unique role to play there. About 300 years after Dante's poem, St. Francis de Sales and St. Jane Frances de Chantal, one of the famous duos in church history, would champion what they call the little virtues when they were founding the Visitation Convent. These sisters at first avoided all outward appearance of religious life. They were going to live in their rooms, dressed very simply, they're not going to have a habit. The church didn't accept that, but that's what they had in mind. But they were going to live these hidden virtues, these little virtues of kindness, gentleness, humility, and thoughtful concern for others. Doesn't sound particularly dramatic, does it? Not like being a martyr. It's like going to heaven because you've been nice. Martyrdom sounds easier to me sometimes. Maybe martyrdom is going to be better. Being nice might be hard. Closer to our own time, Saint Therese of Lisieux would advocate the little way to holiness, a spirituality that resounded with thousands of people. It made holiness possible for them. Something possible for their personalities, something that valued their littleness. Dante was called to instill that same hope. Higher in heaven, when he meets the apostles take him through what can only be called an oral exam. He has a final exam on the 3 theological virtues. When he gets to the virtue of hope, St. James comes forward. His words to Dante reveal the mission upon which Dante was to be sent. He wasn't just there to save his soul. That was part of it. But there was more to it than that. This is what he says. The Emperor of Heaven has willed for you to come into this court before you die and meet his nobles in his inmost halls. And seeing the truth about this company, comfort yourself and others with hope's power. We chose you not just because you needed saving, but because you can write. We chose you so that you can go back and explain that there are people with very different personalities, and that your personality is not an impediment to your holiness. It's a prerequisite of your holiness. Dante is to be a missionary of hope by teaching us the truth about heaven and by helping us see the value of our individuality. We can hope for heaven without having to be able to measure up to the martyrs or the apostles. We don't have to be like anybody else. We need to stop thinking that being holy means being a different person from the one that we are. God desires us in all our individuality. We were designed from all eternity to be unique and to play a unique role in this world and in the next. Our personality, our limitations, our struggles, they don't stand in the way, so long as we're willing for them to be purified. Heaven's possible for us, even for those of us who are not heroes. As God himself revealed to us in the Psalms, he will bless those who fear the Lord, both small and great. Thank you very much.
I was really glad at this talk. I think there was something in there for people new to Dante, as I said about your books, but even more so in person. Something there for first-time readers, for people new just about to explore Dante, and also for those who read Dante again and again, like yourself, and you were able to tie these together and use analogies to make the Divine Comedy new. So it's really quite remarkable. Are you going to take some questions? Okay, thank you.
Anybody willing to ask any questions? You should have asked. Stun them into silence.
Would you say that we're called to be completely as God created us to be?
Yes. Now, with one sort of warning. Be what you are, it can be sometimes a little misleading, because what you are is not something that you know. you have very little idea about what you can really do. We tend to sell ourselves very short and think, I can't do that. Can't possibly do that. Yes, you can. I always thought, for example, that, well, I always knew that I was a snob. And I thought as a result of that really I could only teach graduate students, probably third-year graduate students. You know, cream of the crop only. Other people need not apply because people will annoy me. My mother would say, I hope your students are good. You're so bad with people who are slow. You know, so I might have said, oh, that's just me. But in fact, it turns out I love teaching introductory philosophy and theology to people who speak English as a second language. I can do it with sign language. Yeah. You surprise yourself by what you are. So rather than think you know what you are, and you can be sort of laid back and think, oh, all I have to do is coast to heaven. Because be what you are is easy, isn't it? No. Be what you are intended to be. That might take a lot of work. It's really a process of discovery. You don't know who you are. You'll figure it out by the end. And I can guarantee you, it'll be a bit of a surprise.
I just have a comment from the chat. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Keith and Elizabeth Cassidy.
Oh, thank you, Kate. I might make it next year to Alberta. Working on it.
If I may, picking up on this the word themes, and you mentioned in passing, but I invite you to talk more about this appearance that the souls in paradise are actually in different levels, but the reality that they're actually all, you know, in the same place. Could you
Dante has a couple different places where his head goes.
Yeah.
The first of these is after going through all these spheres, he gets to a place called the Celestial Rows, where everybody is gathered together like in this stadium in one place. And he says, which sphere are we in? And the answer is yes. Everybody's here. I'm like, well, what are we doing up there? We're going through all those spheres. Are they here or are they there? Sort of wonder whether the distinction of the spheres is sort of a projection for us to be able to understand. But they're all together there in heaven. And then when Dante gets to the end, Beatrice says, look back at from heaven down to earth. And he looks down and he can barely see Italy. He's very attached to Florence, as only exiles can be. He can just make it out, and he sort of goes, and then a little bit later on, look back again. And he looks back again and he says, it looks so insignificant. I can't imagine why I was so worried about it. Just a little speck. But you know, that wasn't the final seeming. Then he realizes that he's viewed the universe inside out, and that the center of all things is in fact heaven, and that he's been viewing it from the outside in. He's been traveling to the center of existence, not to the outer reaches. Maybe that's why when the cosmonauts went out to space, they didn't find heaven. They were going in the wrong direction.
Father, can you explain the phenomena of why fewer people read Paradiso as opposed to Oratory, and then everybody, I understand the fascination with the Inferno, but what's the psychology?
I think this, first of all, Inferno is really dramatic and really graphic. You're like, ooh. And, but I think we all have this sense in us of almost watching a traffic accident. You sort of see this sin, and you see its disguise being stripped away, and you go, that's really bad. And there's something fascinating about that, and something repulsive. And I think that power of and the attraction of repulsion, like watching a horror movie. Now, Purgatorio, I think, has a different kind of draw, and at this stage in my life, Purgatorio was my favorite. But I think you sort of have to be committed to being in a state of grace and to taking your life and work on it before Purgatorio becomes something you're really interested in. There isn't a lot of drama because everybody who's there is going to make it. There's no conflict anymore. Everybody there is cheering each other on. When a soul makes it out of purgatory, Dante thought there was an earthquake, but it wasn't an earthquake. The soul had been graduated, and everybody on purgatory stopped and sang the Te Deum. They were all rejoicing so powerfully that he thought it was an earthquake. See, Catholics can sing. So you see the sort of appeal of this, but it becomes the appeal of being free. When I say Mass, I like saying, by your cross and resurrection, you have set us free, as the memorial acclamation, because I think we have to emphasize this desire for freedom, being freed from the burdens of sin. If you're ready for that, then purgatory is great. And if you're desiring more and more support and community, you realize you have it there. Purgatorio is the Catholic community you've always hoped for. No, this is there, it's fine. Paradiso, though, is you might notice if you see the books over there, Paradiso is the fattest volume because it is, in fact, fairly talky. There's no drama. You have arrived. Mm-hmm. And now you're just talking about virtues, and it's fairly abstract. Dante said nobody could put this into words, and so we shouldn't be too surprised that he failed. So I think there's sort of a lacking of drama there. That doesn't mean that heaven isn't dramatic. It's just that we, from where we are, don't find it dramatic. So I think there's reasons like that. I think that we're not really we can all look down on the souls in hell. That's easy. After a while, we can begin to identify with the souls in purgatory. But it's a little presumptuous of us to begin to feel like we belong with the souls in Paradiso. Perhaps something like that. I think it is often theologically the most difficult too. Yes.
I was listening to speech piece about the interior castle. It shows the similarity that it's the mansion, the seventh mansion at the center, that had been in the soul actually on the center. Do you think she was influenced by something?
I don't know. But that idea that somehow we see life inside out is a very fascinating one. You know, of course, we would put us at the center of the universe, right? We accuse people of doing that all the time, but in fact, it's what we do. So I don't know whether there was a historical connection, but certainly there's a sort of common Christian inspiration about that.
Thank you, Father. Two questions. One is, the saints are there as intercessors, but also exemplars.
Yes.
And St. Mary said you should strive for the virtues of St. Peter and Paul in one of his maxims.
Right.
So how do we ally the unique individual with the also following the saints, the lives of the saints?
Sure, and not just any saint, Peter and Paul.
Peter and Paul, yes. And my second question is, do you think Dante actually had a vision, or is it all made up? So,
okay, first thing about shooting for the virtues of Peter and Paul. And St. Philip was really big on that. But as we were saying before, I don't know what my limits are until I test my limits. So I have to push myself beyond what I can do. In university, I was a cellist. I remember working on the Dvorak cello concerto, which was like nosebleed heights for me. There were 12 measures at a time that I could play, but they're not an entire movement. But you know, it was good for me to have to engage with it and to realize, yep, I can't do that. Even after a long time, I couldn't do that. My teacher looked at me and says, yeah, your fingers are too short. One of my parishioners wanted to be a ballet dancer. Her best friend was a ballet dancer. She went to the ballet school in Toronto, and they measured her hips, and they said, oh, thank you. She says, you are going to be like 6 feet tall, and you are going to be a big girl. Imagine that little ballet guy dancer going, to get her in the air. I mean, it's not her fault. She might be a really good mover. But if you're 6 feet tall and weigh 185 pounds, it's going to be the clean and jerk. Once again, it's just the hand she was dealt, isn't it? But you don't know what your limits are spiritually unless you push those limits. And so I find that's, I think, why you set your goals high, because you're really in this process of discovering what you are. Finally, about whether Dante had a vision or it's all made up. I wouldn't be surprised if Dante had a spiritual experience of something. But I think in terms of reading this, I think Dante puts it forward as a journey. And I think we get the most out of it just by treating it like a journey, without asking all the questions about, did he actually go down, and is it really centered on Jerusalem, and is, in fact, Mount Purgatory formed by the impact crater of Satan being thrown down from heaven? It's not really necessary for us to know that. The truths are written there in this literary form. But it's written as a journey, and we should read it as a journey. It's sort of suspension of disbelief a little bit. Just accept the genre in which it's written. So I just don't really ask the question very much. Yes?
Yes, I'm curious, when you teach Dante and introduce people, what translation do you use and recommend?
Yeah, I actually use mainly the translation of Anthony Esselin, which I find to be probably the most readable, but also the most Catholic. He was also good enough to write the preface for my first volume, so thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I think it's a lovely translation. I also, in terms of just accessibility, like Adam Mandelbaum's translations, those are available very simply and inexpensively, very fine. I grew up with the John Sinclair Oxford edition. It's the prose translation, but it's very, very good and has wonderful footnotes. I have a secret love for Dorothy Sayers' translation. John Chardy's poetic translation is pretty good. Some really fine notes in Mark Musa's translation. There are so many. And during the anniversary of Dante's death, his death was just this last year. 7 years ago. What I meant. Even more came out. There are so many translations of Dante. But I think you can't go wrong with the Esselin. And it's in the modern library edition is available quite inexpensively. That's the one I use.
On that same note, which translation would you not recommend?
I haven't really invested in reading a translation that I think my tolerance level, as you could ask my mother, is pretty low about these things. If I don't like it after about 4 lines, I just, toss it aside. But really, I think you don't love Dante enough to translate him unless you're willing to enter into that. So the sort of person who sets out translating Dante is already a fairly select group. I would not particularly recommend Longfellow's translation, just because I think it's not very accurate and it's not particularly accessible English. Although there's a 1 volume of his translation that has all the Gustave Doré engravings. So I own the translation, but for the Gustave Doré illustrations, which also appear, some of them in my books.
Do you want to talk about the levels of hell?
Do I want to talk about
Brief, like, yeah.
Well, strangely enough, the levels of hell, it's like my exam for my PhD. I just want you to know this had nothing to do with my exam topic. I did my PhD on instrumental causality in creation and sacraments. And somebody on my committee was a literature specialist, and she says, can you explain the hierarchy of angels and why there's a different one in St. Thomas and St. Gregory the Great? Fortunately, I just taught this the day before in my class. I said, this isn't exactly on my topic. And she says, I know that, but I have trouble getting theologians to answer my questions. I answered, but yes. Talk about the hierarchy of angels later. Dante starts off rather strangely with people who, the first sort of circle that really aren't even in the circle, are the neutrals. These are the people who never really engaged in the combat, who just decided to coast, to be driven around by fads and trends, and not to make a stand. He says they're worse than bigger sinners because in some sense they never were really human in the first place. They were lukewarm. Because you were lukewarm, I will spew you out of my mouth. They don't make it into heaven, and they don't even make it into hell. They're real outsiders. After that, you basically, aside from limbo, which is a sort of controversial thing in Dante, you have basically sins of passions. Dante says those are the least culpable because they're so powerful. So you're not too surprised when people commit sins of passion. In fact, even if you committed a sin of murder under passion, it'd be less than premeditated murder. Second degree and first degree murder. So the passion sins are up there first. Then I have sins of violence. Because violence and passion and premeditation sort of overlap each other. Then you have a big drop off. And that drop off goes into a place that's pretty cold and stinky. It's like deep dive into the sewer. In fact, some of the circles are encrusted with stuff. Pretty nasty. These are the circle of fraud. And these are worse because you are actually perverting the reason God gave you. Fraud against strangers, fraud against people who really you should have been able to trust. If you are fraudulent against your friends and your neighbors and your family and your country, they deserve better from you. That's a real betrayal. These are traitors. They're at the bottom. Okay. Yes.
You spoke about Dante presenting trilogy as a journey. Can you speak a little bit about his understanding of, let's say, the ultimate destination that's kind of our travel, and something we begin to participate in here in this life, and say, for example, the purgatory, the trials and purification we go through in this life, of being, something we participate in now.
Yeah. Fits in very nicely with another one of St. Philip's maxims. He says, on this earth, there is no purgatory. It's either heaven or hell. Because you either see it as something just contributing to your salvation, or you see it as just a mess. And if you look at it upon it as just a mess, you've left God out of the equation entirely, haven't you? So I think from Dante's point of view, remember Dante is seeing all these things in this life. And what he's seeing, I think, is really a projection of the way sin is right now. So whether it's the damage of sin that you see in hell, that damage isn't just an afterlife damage. It's a damage that's happening right now. It's the damage that we experience. Some of those I read and think, oh, sounds like me. Yeah? And so that's real. And the purgation that we experience is something also that we, in purgatory, is something we can experience in this life. And I think we've probably all had the experience of working on something, maybe not very hard, but having a little progress come right away. A little something that happens, like doing Lent, and you just feel like, yes, I got something done. It might not last very long, but there's such a feeling of exaltation. You feel lighter. You feel like things are possible. You can face a little bit more now. And so I think we get a little bit of sense of that lightening of the spirit. Every once in a while we get some of that sense of community that they experience in purgatory. Whether or not we get a sense of heaven but we at least get a sense of the fact that if I'm faithful to God, everything is productive of heaven. And I think that's that heavenly viewpoint. It's not just staring into the beatific vision, which we don't have, but it's seeing everything as this conspiracy towards heaven. There is a conspiracy out there. I just want you to know that. But there's only one conspiracy, I think, and that's God's conspiracy, because other people aren't organized enough to put together a conspiracy. I've graded their papers, they can't do it. There's one conspiracy that matters, and that's the conspiracy of God arranging everything so that you have the best chance possible to get to heaven. St. Francis de Sales says, if you were the only person in the universe that God was trying to save, he couldn't do anything more for your salvation than he's already doing. The deck is stacked in your favor. And to live with that realization is to live with my eyes firmly set on heaven, and to live with the recognition that God is pulling for me and arranging things for me. I think that's really how heaven becomes a reality now. Thank you.
How was Dante's Divine Comedy received when it was first published?
It was, well, it was quite a stir. Now, first of all, it was published just before his death. He was passing around some of the stuff, especially some of the infernal stuff. But when you're putting your enemies and various popes and bishops into hell, it makes for rather salacious reading. I've actually thought of writing my own insert cantos. Then I thought that just means spirit. So yes, it was pretty well received. I think he didn't see much of it, but he already had a sense of the fact that this was going to be big. So much so that he said, don't you let them take my body back to Florence. I'm not letting the people of Florence profit from me. There's a tomb in Santa Croce in Florence that says Dante on it. He's not there. He's in Ravenna. Yeah. He doesn't want the people of Florence ever to make a profit off him because they didn't support him. So he knew that it was going to be big, enough that he knew that not letting his body to go back would hurt Florence. But he didn't get to live to see most of it.
I think we've put you through your paces, but you've done remarkably well. You certainly passed the exam. I just want to say that it feels like a very historic moment because I understand some of the origins of the college better, the academy, as it was when I came. So when I came here, there were some theologians, but they loved literature. And they even actually knew something about literature. They couldn't teach it, but they did know something about literature. And they appreciated it. They had enthusiasm. So there was a natural sort of sense of belonging to a community that understood and appreciated the liberal arts. And so I can see in your mind the embryo of this college with your love for science and theology and philosophy and of course literature. So it all makes a lot more sense now. And then added to that, the fitting nature of the fact this is Dr. Cassidy, Keith Cassidy lecture, and you're friends with the family. So there's just something really coming full circle. And even to bring it to the present day, I would add that we're just on the cusp of having the organizational review for our four-year degree. That's just about to happen. And this program that in some ways I can see is a continuation of the education that you gave, that you continue to give your seminarians, that John Paul Ainan and Scott Nicholson brought here. It seems like this is a great opportunity to see that trajectory and to invite everyone to pray for that and to, if you feel also inspired to contribute to that, we have a donation basket at the end of the entrance there. And you can also leave your name if you want to have news of the college. And then finally, again, the books are for sale. So Mr. De Gasperis, Lino, there, if you want to just put your hand, yes, he's selling the books. So there's an opportunity to do that. But again, Father Paul Pearson, this was an epic presentation, and I would really thank you so much. Enjoy the evening. There are refreshments at the back as well, everybody, and have a good evening.